Through this series, we've looked at what God's timeline is for this world in terms of future events. We saw the rapture, the next great event on God's calendar. We saw the battle of Gog and Magog as it sets up all of the end time events. We saw the tribulation period as this world begins to descend into chaos, and yet God will use that time as an opportunity to win many people to Him, to save many souls. We saw as the rise in the government of the Antichrist and the combined rule of him and Satan and the false prophet and the terrible conditions that will result in. We saw simultaneously while all of that's happening here on this earth, the marriage supper of the Lamb and the glorious nature of that. We saw the second coming of Christ and the what is known as Armageddon, and the establishment of the kingdom and that perfect utopia. We saw that that kingdom will last for 1,000 years, and at the end of that time, humanity will once again rebel against God. Then we saw the great white throne judgment, where all of the lost are condemned for eternity to hell. And as we begin to come to the end of this series, there will be one more lesson after this one, but we need to ask a question. And this is somewhat rhetorical, but it's an important question to ask. How does the finite understand the infinite? How can that which is limited comprehend that which by its nature is unlimited? In literature, oftentimes an author will, when his book is published, include something in that publication, a chapter, a section from a reading from whatever the next work will be, whether it's a continuation in that series or a new story altogether. And when you come to the end of the book of Revelation, you have something kind of like that in Revelation 21 and 22, a look at just a brief glimpse of what the next great work of God will be. In Revelation 21 verse 5, we read, "Then the one seated on the throne said, 'Look, I am making everything new.' He said, 'Right, because these words are faithful and true.'" That's an interesting statement. Look, I am making everything new. Well, what does that mean? And I think that we can break it down into a few ways that everything will be new. First of all, there's going to be a new creation. In Revelation 21 verse 1, it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea no longer existed." As we saw in the previous lesson, this current creation has been completely corrupted by sin. And because of that, God is going to completely destroy it. We saw that in 2 Peter chapter 3. He is going to destroy everything that currently exists. But he is then going to create a new universe. And this new earth, including a new earth, and this new earth is going to have a perfect environment. It's not going to be like this earth. It's going to be different. For one specific way that it's listed as being different here in verse 1 is that there will no longer be any seas. There will no longer be any oceans. That's not to say that there won't be bodies of water. I don't know if there will be or not. But large bodies of water won't exist. 3/4 of our planet roughly is covered by water, is covered by oceans. Imagine what a planet roughly the same size as ours would be like if there was no ocean covering it. That it would change things drastically. But he continues on there, verse 2. He said, "I also saw a holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride, adorned for her husband." This city is very interesting, and it gets focused on a whole lot. And and rightfully so, because it is largely the focus of these two chapters. But it says in chapter 21, beginning in verse 10, it says, "He then carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, arrayed with God's glory. Her radiance was like a very precious stone, like a jasper stone, bright as crystal. The city had a massive high wall with 12 gates. 12 angels were at the gates, and the names of the 12 tribes of Israel's sons were inscribed on the gates. And there were 3 gates on the east, and 3 gates to the north, and 3 gates to the south, and 3 gates to the west. And the city had 12 foundations, and the 12 names of the Lamb's 12 apostles were on the foundation." So there's going to be this brand new city, this city that's named Jerusalem, that God creates. But this is not the same Jerusalem that we know of today. This is not the Jerusalem of the kingdom that, as we saw, would be lifted up and become the highest point on the face of this earth. It's a completely different city altogether. And again, I'm not going to take the time to go through and to look at everything about it, but it's going to be made of what we consider to be precious stones and precious metals. Both Israel and the church are going to be honored in it. Israel is going to be honored by each of the 12 gates being named, given the name of one of the sons of Jacob, while the city will have 12 foundations. And how that works, I don't know. We have our knowledge of construction establishes a single foundation, and that foundation being the earth. How this city will have 12 foundations, I don't know, but it will have 12 foundations, and each of those 12 foundations will have inscribed on it the name of the apostles. And the reason why is through these, God is honoring the two groups that He has most commonly used throughout history, namely the nation of Israel and the organization that we think of as the church. This New Jerusalem, it's going to be the dwelling place of both the redeemed Jew and the redeemed Gentile. It is the home for all of those who have come to know Christ, all of those who as it says in the beginning of the book of Revelation, all of the victors. In verse 15, John gives some more details concerning this city. It says, "The one who spoke with me had a gold measuring rod to measure the city, its gates, and its walls. The city is laid out in a square, its length and width are the same. And he measured the city with a rod at 1,200 stadia. Its length, width, and height are equal. Then he measured its wall, 144 cubits, according to human measurements which the angel used." So he is given here the measurements of this city. This city is cubical. When it says that the city is laid out in a square, that's what it means. It's a square in 3 dimensions. It's a cube. And starting with the walls, he says that there are 144 cubits, and most likely you're not familiar with the relation of cubits to measurements that we use today, or the relation of stadia to what we use today. But he says that the walls are 144 cubits, the walls of the city. And by the way, the city, it's not going to sit on the earth. It's going to be suspended in the heavens above the earth. But you'll understand why here in a moment. But the walls of this city, when it says there are 144 cubits, that means that the walls are 72 yards thick, nearly 3/4 the length of a football field thick. While the city itself, it says there is 12,000 stadia, that translates to 1,380 miles in length, width, and height. To give you a kind of a way to picture this is roughly the size of all of the land from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River and the border of Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. And it's going to be that squared, or that cubed, excuse me. It's not going to sit on this earth. Obviously, if it sat on this earth, it would be like a giant box on the new earth. But instead, it's going to be a little bit different. In fact, when you go in, you begin to look at what the Bible has to say about this new city and the new uh, the new nature of the new creation. It says in verse 23 of chapter 21, the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, because God's glory illuminates it, and its lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk in its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Each day its gates will never close, because it will never be night there. In chapter 22 and verse 5, it says, night will no longer exist, and people will not need lamplight nor sunlight, because the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. So this new creation, it's going to be centered around all of the whatever universe God creates, and to what extent it is, we don't know, but it's going to be centered around the New Jerusalem. It will all revolve around that. He says that there will be no night there in the city. The city will always be fully lit, fully bright. There's not going to be any dark spots, but not only that, but there's not going to be any darkness on the new earth either, or throughout the universe. We oftentimes say that the very nature of having light shine means that shadows are cast, but that's not going to be the case there. I don't know exactly how this works, but none of creation will ever know night again, will ever know darkness again. And you think about right now, as our planet rotates in the heavens, the sun illuminates our planet, but half the planet is in darkness, and the reason it's in darkness is because it's not facing the sun. In that day, there's not going to be that problem. I don't know how that works. I can't begin to explain it. But what all I can tell you is, from all indications, is God is going to create a new universe with a completely different physical laws. What we think we know about this universe and this creation, and the laws that govern how this universe works, and by the way, we don't know as much as we think we know. You have competing theories that stand in place, and in fact, the rules don't the rules that apply to large scale bodies like planets and stars don't apply to small particles, like subatomic particles. It's the difference uh, between relativity and quantum physics, and we don't have a full understanding. We have a lot of theories, but proving it is something completely different. And yet, that creation, that universe, that new creation, it's going to operate completely different. All of the laws of nature that we think we know of today will cease to exist. But it's not just going to be in the new universe, a new creation in that way. There's going to be a new spiritual life when God says that He makes all things new. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 2, John makes an amazing statement. He says, "Dear friends, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet been revealed. We know that when He appears, we will be like Him, because we will see Him as He is." What John's saying is those people who are saved, what they will ultimately be like in that day, in eternity, in the glorification process, we don't understand the full extent of what that means. And again, this is John. This is the Apostle John who is writing this. He's the same person who wrote the Gospel of John. He wrote all three of the epistles of John. He's the one who gave us the book of Revelation. He knew the resurrected Jesus personally, saw Him personally, encountered Him. And yet what he says is, we don't know the full extent of the abilities. We don't know the full extent of what it meant when Jesus was resurrected. On that first Easter, he says the what was true about His resurrected body will be the same with ours, but the full extent of that, we don't know what it is, except that we will be like that. And that's an amazing reality, because Jesus was not confined by, again, by the physical laws as we know them. He could appear, he could disappear, he could travel great distances in the blink of an eye. We don't, that, locked doors didn't keep him out. He ascended up to heaven, floated up in the air. We don't know the full extent of what it means, but that we will be like him. But it goes beyond that, and back in Revelation 21 verse 4, it says, He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will no longer exist. Grief, crying, and pain will no longer exist, because the previous things have passed away. See, all of the pain and the sorrow and the hardships we experience in this life are not going to exist there. Those all come as a direct result of sin and the corruption of sin on we as human beings and upon our universe. That new creation will not have that corrupting influence whatsoever. And so all of those things that we experience here will not be experienced there. And what's more is our relation is how our relationship with God becomes. See, on this earth we're very limited, and in Exodus 33 and verse 20, kind of a little background on this. Moses had asked God, said, I want to see you. I want to see your face. And in verse number 20 of Exodus 33, God is answering back, and he says, but he answered, you cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live. That is God answering Moses. And the point being this, that Moses, my glory, my presence, because you are a sinful creature, because you are imperfect, it would destroy you. It would kill you. My glory, my holiness would. And so if you go through and you study out what happened, what God did is he hid Moses behind the cleft of a rock, and he passed by, and as he passed by, he covered Moses with his hand so that Moses wouldn't be exposed to the full glory of God. And God passed by, and then he allowed Moses just to catch the merest afterglow of God's presence. And the net result is that Moses' face literally shined with light for quite some time after that, to the point to where he had to wear a veil because it was so frightening to the people. But in Revelation 21 and verse 3, we have this amazing statement. It says, Then I heard a loud voice from the throne, Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and their God. See, in that day, the believer is going to live in perfect fellowship with God, and that day, there won't be this issue where we can't see God. No one on this earth has ever come face to face. You who are listening to this right now, you have never seen God. You have never physically, visibly seen him. You have never audibly heard his voice. He doesn't work in that way. In that day, we will. And so there's going to be this new spiritual life that's going to exist, in which we don't live by faith, we live with personal interaction with the Lord. And there's going to be new relationships. You see, in this world, we have a lot of things that divide and create conflict. All of these things are the result of sin, and they've been in existence since the start of humanity. Wealth and resources. How many wars have been started over wealth, over resources? How many atrocities have been done to acquire money? It's a issue within our world. Racism and national differences have led to suffering. Of course, we are fully aware of the horrors of those who have believed that other races are inferior, should be wiped out. And not just that, but even other nations, nation rising up against nation, hostility between nations has resulted in a lot of suffering. Political ideology, it regularly divides. In the United States, we we see where one person will assume that Republicans are evil because this person's a Democrat, or vice versa. This person's a Republican, so they think all Democrats are evil. These are things that divide, that cause conflict, that create problems within our nation. But in Revelation 22, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Then he showed me the river of living water, sparkling like crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the broad street of that city. The tree of life was on both sides of the river, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit every month. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations, and there will no longer be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in that city, and his slaves will serve him." You see, things we mark as valuable, they're not going to be anything more than building materials there. All of the wealth and the resources that we look at, that our world fights over, that's kind of the same as concrete in heaven. Why fight over it? There won't be any differing races or competing national governments. There's just going to be God's people. And there won't be any political ideology. There's just going to be God's command. All of these things that divide, all of these things that create conflict, all of these things that are destroyed, all of the issues that cause suffering and conflict are going to be healed in that day. And that new creation will exist in perfect peace. And then there will be a new purpose. One of the things that people oftentimes struggle with is what is the reason that I'm here? What is my purpose for being here? And there is an answer to that. I'm not going to get into that today. But in that day there will be a new purpose, a great purpose. Back in chapter 21, beginning in verse 24, it says, "The nations will walk in its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Each day its gates will never close, because it will never be night there. They will bring glory and honor of the nations into it. Nothing profane will ever enter it, nor one who does what is vile or false, but those written in the Lamb's book of life." You see, there will be some sort of form of government that will encompass the earth. And the indication here is that in the new creation, like in the original, it will be managed by its inhabitants. What I mean by that is this: when you go back to the original creation, back in Genesis, and we know the story that God created all of this universe in 6 days. On the seventh day, He rested. But in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15, we get a little bit of an insight here. It says, "The Lord God took man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and watch over it." You see, Adam wasn't just placed in the garden and said, "Well, enjoy." No, Adam was given a specific job. He was given specific duties. He was given something to do, certain responsibilities. And the indication here is that there will be responsibilities that, if you have this idea that heaven consists of us laying back on a cloud and playing a harp, you're wrong. There is responsibility. There is work that will be done. And for all of eternity, we will be engaged. Now, some people look at that and they think that that's a negative, but not at all. We are created to have responsibility. We are created to work. And the thing that makes work difficult in the current creation is the curse of sin. You go in and you study out what God said is that Adam, you're going to have to work hard. It's going to be laborious. It's going to be tedious. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging because of sin. But when sin's curse is removed, work becomes a joy. And this brings us back to the question that we started with. How does the finite know and understand the infinite? It's a big question. It's a question that I don't know that there's a perfect answer to. But I want you to see something. In Revelation 21, starting back in verse 5, where we started this at, it says, Then the one seated on the throne said, Look, I am making everything new. He also said, Write, because these words are faithful and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give water as a gift to the thirsty from the spring of life. The victor will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. See, we are finite beings. We are limited in our capacities. What our capacities will be in eternity, we don't know. Like John said, what we will be, we do not yet know. We do not yet understand. But we know that our relationship with God is going to be perfected in that time. But that doesn't mean we're going to possess all knowledge. It doesn't mean that God's going to just download every truth into our brains. See, God himself is infinite. He identifies himself, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. God was in existence before creation. He will be in existence for all of eternity after this creation ceases to be. And for us to understand him, for us to understand in the slightest the way God is, the way God thinks, the way God operates, it's beyond us. In Isaiah 55:9, it says, For as heaven is higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. See, because of the very nature of God, it will take all of eternity to learn all there is about God. And when we say all of eternity, we don't mean day and night, time immemorial. Eternity is existence without time. As we saw, there's not going to be night and day. How do you judge time? Time will not be in existence then. Not as we know it. It will simply be eternity. And it's going to take all of eternity to learn all there is about God. I have to say that of all of the portions in this series on the timeline, this last one is probably the most difficult. And the reason why is twofold. Number one, because of this question that we started off, that we are looking at right now. How does the finite understand the infinite? But also the fact that we're very limited in what God reveals to us. And anyone who claims to understand what that new creation will be like, they're lying. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning in verse 2, Paul writing here says, I know a man in Christ who was caught up into the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether he was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. I know that this man, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows, was caught up into paradise. He heard inexpressible words, which a man is not allowed to speak. In other words, what Paul is saying here, most commentators believe that Paul is actually talking about himself when he wrote this, is that the reality of what that day will be like is beyond our comprehension. There aren't the words to describe it. There isn't the explanation available. That day will be so much more glorious than you can ever possibly understand.